Today we're back with the next installment of 3 on 3. Today we'll be reviewing 3 absolute grail watches. We're talking in-house manually wound chronographs. We have from Patek Philippe the 5170G with Kieran. Myself, I have the Vacheron Harmony chronograph with the caliber 3300, and Jack has the A. Lange & Söhne Datograph up-down. So, these are really grail watches for so many of us. They are all relatively expensive, they're all in-house made, they are all expertly finished, and they are, in our belief, really some of the best watches that money can buy from a major brand. So Jack, if you could, tell us about your time with the Datograph.
I find the Datograph a tremendously satisfying watch to have on the wrist. The first impression that you have, and it's a lasting impression when you wear it, is of something that is phenomenally well built. I mean, German engineering is a bit of a cliche, but it really does feel like that's what you're getting when you put this on. In terms of operation, it's absolutely delightful to use every single aspect of the watch. The chronograph start, stop, and reset is absolutely buttery smooth. It's a larger watch, certainly relative to the Paddock. It's platinum, this particular model, and it's got a very substantial mass on the wrist, but it is sufficiently well constructed, and the ergonomics of the strap attachment are intelligent enough that it's actually quite comfortable to wear. Certainly, I would say it's a watch you're going to be aware you have on your wrist, but it's one you don't mind having there.
And Kieran, if you could, a little bit about the 5170.
Sure, I had the Paddock 5170G, and I think one of the things you notice most about it, in contrast to the Dato, is that it's so svelte. It's a very thin, moderately sized timepiece. It's only 39.4 millimeters in diameter, and it fits very nicely under a shirt cuff. You barely notice it's there. And also, it has the same kind of buttery smooth operation that you get from the Dato. So I feel like it's the slimmer, svelte choice among these 3.
Sure, and I spent some time with Vacheron's brand new Harmony chronograph, and this is an interesting watch to me because the manually wound chronograph is really kind of a tenet of great watchmaking. And Vacheron, up until 2015, did not have one. They were using Lemania-based calibers for generations. Not that there's anything wrong with that, as they say, Patek was doing it as well. However, with the introduction of the Datograph in 1999, and certainly the 5170 and some other watches from Paddock in 2010, it really became apparent that Vacheron was lagging behind the other 2 in this group without their own chronograph. So this was a big deal for Vacheron. It is interesting in that it's a mono pusher with a power reserve. It is a large watch. This is significantly larger than the Patek. It's about in line, actually 1 millimeter larger than the Datograph. It does not have the same buttery soft feel that we see in the Datograph or the Patek for that matter. It is, in fact, quite hard to start and stop. And I've spoken with some folks at Vacheron about this, and they say that they really wanted to build something that is really all or nothing, in their words. So if you start and stop a Patek or a Lange and you don't push the start and stop button as hard as possible, then the gears will start to turn, but the chronograph will not start to work. And that will actually cause some harm to the movement. With the Vacheron, however, their thinking is that you have to push it so hard so that the entire thing begins to work, and therefore it is longer lasting. Something else that's interesting is the overall kind of shift from eBausch chronographs to in-house chronographs, and that was really jump-started by the Datograph.
Absolutely. To me, one of the great things about the Datograph is, of course, the movement. The dial is beautifully done, and it's at the level you would expect from Lange. Certainly the quality of the case is what you would expect from a brand with Lange's reputation, but the real action with the Datograph is when you turn it over and you see this absolutely beautifully constructed Lange caliber L951.6, I believe, which follows on from the original Datograph movement. It's not only one of the great classic chronograph movements of modern watchmaking, but one of the great classic, I think, chronograph movements of all time. Very traditional construction, of course, lateral clutch engagement for the chronograph. It was clearly not constructed with thinness as a priority. This is a very architectural movement. It's extremely three-dimensional, and you see an absolutely exquisite, meticulous level of finish throughout that is, I think, matched by very few other players in the industry.
And you have to remember that the Datograph came out a good, I would say, 8 years before Patek released their first simple manually wound chronograph, which we now see inside the 5170. So how does the 5170's movement compare to the Datograph?
Well, maybe to talk a little bit about the history, like you said, in '99, the Dato came out. The predecessor to this watch, the 5070, came out in '98, and it was using a Lemania movement. And it basically took until 2010 for Paddock to upgrade this with an in-house version of the movement. That watch was released in 2010 in yellow gold, and the white gold version came out 3 years later, 2013. This version we see right here with the white gold dial. And then this year, they introduced the black dial version of this watch. And we can see the movement may not have the same level of inward angles, beautiful finishing as the Longa, but it's still a very good looking movement. You lose a little of the depth of the Longa, but you gain the fact that it's 2 millimeters thinner, which is pretty huge.
I think, to Kieran's point, the Longa is certainly, I would say, the most beautiful movement to look at out of all three, really. However, it is beautiful for a reason. It is so deep that you really gain so much depth in the watch that you lose, in my opinion, some wearability. The watch, as we measured it on our own micrometer, was 13.45 millimeters thick. That is well over 2 millimeters thicker than the Patek Philippe, and 2 millimeters on an $80,000 watch, to me, means a lot. The Vacheron is really somewhere in between. The thickness is about 12 millimeters, 12.81, excuse me. The movement is somewhere, again, in between the Longa and the Patek. You have the gold engraved balance cock, which in my belief really is something that is owned by Longa these days, so I don't necessarily love it on this Vacheron. I'm told they'll only be using it on the anniversary models, which this of course is. But I think, this movement is beautifully finished for sure. It is a mono pusher. It does not, in fact, have the same smooth feel of the Longa or the Patek. The watch that we have here is a press sample. They are for sale right now, but I do think that this is a work in progress, and I do think that there will be some tweaks to this movement, just as there are tweaks to the datograph and there have been tweaks to the caliber inside the 5170 to make it, I think, perhaps a little bit smoother, because I really think, at this price point, you would expect something a little bit softer. We've covered the ups and downs of the movements and the cases of these three watches, and there's one kind of X factor hanging out there that we haven't discussed yet, and that's the price. These are all expensive watches. These are watches that in many cases you have to save up for, and really is a major purchase no matter really kind of what position you're in life. So let's talk a little bit about price. We'll kind of go in descending order. So the Lange & Söhne datograph in platinum is $90,700.
Certainly, and you're obviously paying a premium for the case metal to make it a little bit more of an apples-to-apples comparison. In pink gold, the datograph is $72,500, which I would say with the addition of the flyback function and large dates certainly makes it purely from a price point perspective competitive with the Vacheron and the Paddock.
Sure, and so the Patek is $81,000.
That's right, which feels like it's relatively competitively priced compared to these two. I mean, you're going to get the value retention that Paddocks tend to have, and it's really kind of a minor premium that you're paying for what is really a much more wearable piece, being so much thinner and smaller in diameter.
There is something that Patek has that Vacheron and Lange do not, and that is a certain collectability that these watches just can't compete with. And so you are paying slightly more than the Vacheron, which is $69,000 retail in pink gold, but you have something that actually may be worth more over time. We don't know, certainly, and I would never say that it will be, but we don't know.
In general, I would say at this level of reputation and at this level of cost, absolutely everything is a consideration. And, purely from a psychological perspective as a buyer, one likes to know that one is buying a watch that will retain its value.
Certainly. So this watch is $69,000 retail. In the past, they've been using Lemania movements in their patrimony chronographs, and those have retailed in the high 50s, but then sold, secondhand for considerably less. The same is true also for the datograph, and that is something that you simply can't ignore when you're spending $90,000 on a watch.
Indeed.
It really just comes down to, I think, personal taste. Some people prefer the datograph because of the movement that has been blessed by no less than Philippe Dufour as the greatest chronograph ever made. This Vacheron is something compelling and completely different, really, than the other two. It's brand new. And like I said, this is in a limited edition kind of cushion case that will not be around forever. There are only 260 examples of this in celebration of 260 years of Vacheron. And then we have the Patek 5170, which is a very traditional, very elegant chronograph that is in line with the old 1463s and 130s of Patek from the 1940s and 50s. So Jack, if you had to pick, which one would it be?
I suppose it will surprise no one to hear that my personal preference would be the Lange & Söhne datograph. I actually find the presence of the watch, the additional presence of the watch, one of its attractions. There's a feeling that you get when you close a bank vault door. You have this massive piece of metal, but it's so perfectly machined that you can push the door shut with one finger. There's something intrinsically kinesthetically exciting about that combination of relative massiveness and precision. Now, it's a very particular kind of taste. You obviously have to like that sort of thing for this to be a compelling wristwatch to consider. But if that's where the sweet spot is for you, I really don't think there's an offering out there that quite compares.
And Kieran, what about you?
Well, I think it's always you're on rocky ground when you're maybe disagreeing with Philippe Dufour, but I'd have to go with the Paddock. It's just the one that you could wear every day, and it feels so comfortable. You don't even notice it on the wrist, wears so well. And, I love the legibility, and it's just a great watch to wear.
Yep. And thickness of a watch is something that is really very important to me. What's funny is that in 2012, the datograph actually got larger in diameter, but in my opinion became even more well balanced. I still think it is quite thick relative to these other two chronographs. That said, the datograph is unparalleled in regards to movement finishing, movement architecture, things like that. If you turn it over, you really understand what makes Lange special. And the datograph is absolutely a very special watch. It just happens to be thicker than the other two. The Vacheron is a completely different watch than the other two for a variety of reasons. The other two are serially produced watches. This is a limited edition celebrating the anniversary of Vacheron Constantin. It is also in a cushioned case, which is obviously a totally different type of wear than a round watch. And anytime you move away from a round watch, I tend to think that you're sort of limiting the mass appeal of a watch. Having said that, this movement is something different. It is really an advanced chronograph. It is a mono pusher. It has very special kind of configuration that allows it to last much, much longer. And I think to a chronograph lover, this is really a very special watch. And the 5170 is, really as kind of pure as it gets. This is really in line with the 1463s and the 130s of the 1940s and 50s. And I think for the vintage lover in me, which I think you guys all know that I am, this is really one that strikes my fancy in a very real way. It just does everything super well. It's got a svelte case, in-house movement, and of course, coming from Patek Philippe, we know that it will have lasting value.